Hi, my name is Kirk Emerson. I am a professor of practice at the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. I started out long ago, back in the 70s, in urban planning, and I learned from my mentor about collaborative planning and engagement of stakeholders at the local level in the urban environment. And from there, I became increasingly interested in mediating and negotiating conflicts between multiple parties and participants who wanted to shape their environment, whether it's their built or their natural environment. Right now I'm particularly interested in looking at the effectiveness of the National Environmental Policy Act, which has been on the books for close to 50 years. And it has never really reached its full potential as a piece of legislation that is a hallmark in engaging people in the management of their natural resources. And so I'm exploring now through the opportunities of big data to explore how the process of environmental reviews shape their final decisions, and in particular how public comment, engagement of stakeholders in those NEPA processes affect the quality of the decisions, as well as the science, and how informed those decisions are by the science that we include in those analyses. There are moments when everybody gets it, the light bulb goes off, and people around the table who have been disgruntled and upset and divisive and not getting another person's perspective, they suddenly realize, if we did it this way, or if we look at the problem in that frame, or gee, maybe there's another avenue to solve our problem so that everyone can gain from it.
We're going to go ahead and get started. First off, welcome to Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Department Seminar. My name is James Garlant. I'm a grad student here in the Public Lands Policy group. Before I begin, I just want to invite you all to hang out afterward for some refreshments, kind of mingle and talk. Dr. Emerson will be here at least for another hour. So with that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speaker today, Dr. Kirk Emerson. Dr. Emerson is a professor of practice in the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona, where she also has joint appointments in the School of Planning and Public Health. Dr. Emerson has a long-standing career in environmental conflict resolution, collaborative problem solving as a practitioner, trainer, researcher, and administrator. She was the first director of the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution at the Adult Foundation, and that's the federal government's first independent environmental resolution program. In 2015, she became an elected fellow of the National Academy of Management, and she was recently appointed the first editor of the new journal Perspectives on Public Management and Governance. Dr. Emerson's environmental research focuses on collaborative governance, interagency cooperation, and conflict management, with particular focus on climate change, public lands management, and conflict management within the border. U.S.-Mexico border. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So with that, we're very excited to have you here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kirk Emerson.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk about two of my favorite topics, environmental conflict resolution and collaborative governance. Great turnout. Hope we don't violate any fire codes here. So I would like to first get a sense of who is in this room. So I expect it's a pretty eclectic audience. So how many of you are master's students getting graduate professional degrees? Okay, and probably you and maybe some others are practitioners who are doing land management, forestry, practitioners from agencies? Okay, all right, great. Undergrads? Got some undergrads here? Oh, terrific. And PhD students? Oh, all right, and some faculty, of course. I have to give you some credit for being here. There are a few faculty members. Great. Okay, so I sort of thought that's what who would be here. So this is not a traditional research talk. It is sort of a overview of where the field is, what we've learned, and then I'm going to conclude before I talk a bit about my current research on the challenges we face, some of the long-term trends, and then some of the immediate trends for dealing with the current what is called VUCA times that we're facing. So I am delighted that we can be here for this hour, and I will stay here for another hour and talk with you all together or individually. There seem to be a lot of folks interested in NEPA, and that would be that could be a whole full hour of conversation, but we can launch into that for those of you who are interested in talking about NEPA or border issues. That's where I'm focusing right now. So, but let me start here. Until I started preparing this talk, I conceptually was thinking, and have in my practice, separated environmental conflict management, environmental conflict resolution, and collaborative governance. And my career sort of followed that distinction. But in fact, when you're managing conflicts, you find moments and opportunities to engage people in collaborating and reaching some kind of agreement. And when you're dealing with collaborative systems or regimes, as my co-author Tina Nabachi and I describe collaborative governance regimes, you are inevitably going to surface conflicts that'll have to be dealt with. So I didn't used to think there was this much of a distinction, but I'll just give you a sense of my own career trajectory to show you how I've come to that conclusion, and we'll talk a little bit more about commonalities and distinctions across those two fields, or maybe one field. So I'm also going to share my career trajectory because in the conversations I've been having in the last 2 days, a lot of people have been asking about how do you move from practice to research or out of research into the field, and I've had the opportunity to do that. Fortunately, in my career, it's not always that easy, but just to show you what has happened to one person's life. I started out being intrigued with environmental mediation, and that came about when I was, in fact, practicing as a county planner back in Pennsylvania, north of Philadelphia, along the Delaware River in Bucks County. And in my graduate training for my master's work, I was mentored by someone who had been promoting collaborative planning back in the 70s and eventually got very much involved with environmental mediation, Larry Susskind. And so when I went into planning, increasingly I was frustrated that when we are developing comprehensive plans, building and zoning ordinances, and so forth, that we couldn't engage more creatively and constructively with local municipalities. We had 63 in that one county, as well as other stakeholders. And I eventually left, in large part because of that. I started getting training in multi-party negotiation and in environmental mediation. I carried people's bags. I volunteered at community mediation centers. I'm actually quite typical of a lot of people in my generation who wove their way into this field of mediation and facilitation, and started a small practice before I decided it was time to go back and get a PhD, what I thought at the time was a mid-career PhD in political science and public policy, which I did in Bloomington, Indiana at SPIA. And that was a real eye-opener for me, and I came to understand a lot more about institutions and public policy, obviously, and regulatory regimes, and the real tensions that are going on, that are fermenting underneath the political polarization of today, or that have been the basic tensions in our federal system since it was first forged. So from there, I ended up in Tucson. I was continuing to work on my dissertation, but I landed at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy at the University of Arizona, and I had the opportunity to build a university-based program on stakeholder engagement. We worked on collaborative watershed issues. I got involved in range management and collaboratives there, Malpai Borderland Group, Altar Valley Conservation Alliance. Some of those you've studied already. Several of you know about that, and endangered species challenges like the ferruginous pygmy owl that led to one of the largest habitat conservation programs in the country, the Sonoran Desert Habitat Conservation Plan, Restoration Plan. So I was just about to go on the academic job market and was at the right time in the right place to be asked to run this new federal program, the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution. And that is a story unto itself, but that is the basis for a lot of my experience at the federal level, working with federal agencies who, of course, many of whom are involved in making environmental decisions either by design, by mission, or by the very fact that they are proposing federal actions and are affected by NEPA and other federal laws when they do their mission-oriented work. So I had a much larger perspective then on the development of this field of environmental conflict resolution and what is now called ECCR, Environmental Collaboration in Conflict Resolution. So fortunately, after 10 years in doing that and building a program and a national roster for professionals and doing a lot of evaluation work, I was able to get back into academia and am now at the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. So I really wanted to move from the management of discrete environmental disputes to looking more system-wide at how to build collaborative systems and what the informal relationships we were beginning to see on the ground in community-based collaboratives, for example, what they were all about. You're very familiar with them here in Colorado. You're one of the sort of hot spots of that kind of collaborative engagement. And so that has been informing my work over the last 8 or 10 years. I do actually distinguish between ECR and collaborative governance. ECR tends to focus on individual disputes that are bounded spatially and temporally. And collaborative governance operates in human systems. I'm not sure they're organizations, something I'm working on right now, but systems of ongoing interactions among diverse stakeholders over time. And while these are important distinctions in scale and extended dynamics of human interaction, they do have in common that they're bringing people together, most often representing organizations and constituencies, people who have different interests, appreciations, understandings, values, commitments to the presenting problem or the situation. People who are in fact interdependent. They cannot achieve their goals by themselves. They must, by the nature of the problem or the context, begin to interact and work with others. And they must essentially engage in some form of knowledge sharing, problem framing and problem solving, and shared decision making of some kind, some form of consensus development. They are also processes that require skills to convene and manage and facilitate. They both present process design challenges. They both exist within a context of public policy, law, and regulation that bounds the possible options for agreement and solutions and implementation. So where are we now in this field, having defined it of ECR, ECCR, and CG, collaborative governance, or collaborative governance regimes? So I'm going to talk a bit about the progress in the last 15-some years, maybe 20 years, since the very first recorded environmental mediation that occurred over a dispute in the Snoqualmie watershed in the state of Washington. So we're getting on close to 50 years of work in this arena. We still think of these as innovative, and for those of you who are just learning about this stuff, it really does sound exciting and wow, no one's ever done this before. Well, there has been a lot of work in this field, a lot of practice, a lot of stories and case studies to learn about, and an increasing amount of research, which I'll talk about. So in practice, where are we? We now have many more skillful mediators and facilitators and process managers than we used to. The profession is expanding in different ways. We have more skillful participants, and we have some repeat players too, right? We have more skillful public managers, land management. Agencies are expecting a lot of their line officers and resource managers to use these skills and to engage in collaborative work. And many public managers are developing these skills, and you're in school to do that, just that, so that their portfolios, their repertoire of work goes beyond the flora and fauna and the ecosystems that you are passionate about to engaging people in making sure there's stewardship and sustainable management going forward. We have more government programs. We have protocols, we have resources, matching grants, programs, and so forth that, except perhaps for the moment at the federal level, I should say that, than we ever had before. And there are more convening organizations, some call them bridging or boundary organizations, that are able to bring institutionally people together under impartial, fair, professional auspices. So practice has really been evolving and strengthening, forming over the last several decades, and as it has advanced, the locus of a lot of this work really is upstream, if you will, to collaborative engagement, as opposed to the downstream mediation of fully formed, often escalated disputes. Now, that may be and importantly, to try to proactively engage stakeholders before disputes ripen. It also could be cynically, because agencies are less likely, or they're cautious about what they think is turning their power and their authority over to a third party neutral, which is not the way to frame it, but I think there's resistance there. And it's much easier to engage a process manager than a mediator to work on not fully formed issues on the ground. In the research arena, the good news is that research is beginning to catch up with practice. So you need to understand the credit really goes to the pioneers out on the land, public managers and stakeholders who started coming together, many of them out of frustration that things were not happening in the governmental level, right? In part because our problems have become very complex and they don't actually fit with the institutions that we built decades and decades and decades ago to solve simpler problems. So from the research side, we now have empirical evidence that context matters, which means you really can't just use a cookie-cutter approach, a standard manual to bring people together and make it generate authentic engagement. You have to really think about the challenges, the context, political, technological, ideological, resource, the socio-ecological systems here that will bound the opportunities for engagement. And the types of process matter. It matters when you're doing a public dialogue to design it in a certain way, to set the expectations of the players in a certain way, which are very different than a closed session mediation or a two-tiered system of engagement through a NEPA scoping process. So we are also beginning to be able to measure the process variables themselves within ECR and collaborative governance, like improved working relationships, trust building, and we can measure better outputs like agreements reached and participant satisfaction, perceptions of cost effectiveness of a process. And finally, I would say really in the last 6 years or so, you're beginning to see research studies that are in fact making the connection between collaborative engagement and outcomes on the ground, environmental quality, watershed improvements, and so forth. So let me talk also for a moment about how these processes, these forums, if you will, have made a contribution, I believe, to natural resource management as a field. Okay? So I mentioned the complexity of the wicked problems we're facing today, and the dispute resolution field began in part in the legal framework of trying to create forums that fit the fuss. And what we have been doing in this experimentation of engagement with multiple stakeholders is creating forums that better fit and adapt to the nature of the issues, the nature of the conflicts, the nature of the environmental challenge they face. So we have multidimensional, cross-jurisdictional, complex, unintended consequences of past policies, legacy issues that just no longer align with the nature of the problems we're now facing. So these forums have provided to land managers and to this field of resource management, I think, lots of opportunities to open up the black box and do a better job. There's also, as I mentioned just briefly, an accumulation of practice knowledge bearing out in research that is improving management and management skills. So people now understand that they need to build trust among stakeholders with their permittees. They understand the value of networks and building bridges across different kinds of groups and individuals. Property owners, for example, inholders. The need to include diverse participants in conversations you have in the public, not just whoever comes to the open house, right? You have to reach out to all of the critical areas where stakeholders have a stake. And we also know how important it is to really engage people. A study that I was leading when I was at the Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution was to look at all the cases that other agencies and ourselves were generating to see what some of the factors to the outcomes we wanted to see occur were. And we identified that effective engagement was a really important variable, more than any of the other ones, and it worked directly on the outcomes of agreements reached, relationships built, and the quality of those agreements, and also the other kinds of factors like mediation skills, willingness of parties to participate, resources and information used. Those often worked through the process of effective engagement to influence better outcomes. The other thing that I think this field has done, it's bring social science to resource science. And now we manage public lands and natural resources not just as feather, fur, and friends and fish, but friends, I should say. You know, as you leave this school or come back, that you have to deal with other human beings. And there are many ways in which you can learn and many skills to develop in communication and in management, understanding how people think and behave, so that understanding power and political influence, institutional incentives and so forth, so that you can do a better job when you engage with a regulated community, with critical property owners, environmental advocates, resource corporations, and so forth. So I think there are a lot of ways in which this work has contributed and improved natural resource management. Finally, these processes really are great experiments in the democratization of resource management. And that is our sort of normative lens through which many of us think about collaboration and those benefits of democratic participation and engagement. It is a normative lens, but an important one. I tend to look through the instrumental lens myself, and I'm very interested in outcomes, but I understand that engagement and relationships help enrich those quality outcomes. But there is a very important normative lens to the work we do. And I think there are grounds for optimism looking forward. So we have these expanding capabilities of actors, we have new institutional resources, we have new technologies that can bring people together at a distance in a much more effective way than we did just 5 years ago. Really, really important, and particularly with rural communities, right? We're working on reservations. Yet, the big but, there are lots of challenges. And as I mentioned, I want to talk about some of the emerging trends that have posed challenges to this work over the last 10 years or so, and then how do you work in the more immediate environment that we are facing. So one of the long-term trends is that public agencies, public managers have begun to internalize these processes. They have become more skillful, and they are able now to convene collaborative efforts to, in fact, do some mediation work with their stakeholders. And the concern among some, though I think this is a really important move for institutionalization of this work, is that will the focus be on really finding innovative solutions, on facing challenges to the current hardwired regulations that constrain our management efforts? Or are some of these efforts just built around trying to check off the boxes, legitimize a process or an agency decision through some more pro forma engagement exercise than real engagement with people where you're trying to build buy-in and commitment to future efforts, be it collaborative monitoring, stewardship activity on the ground, and so forth. The second trend that you're all familiar with and that affects this work is the hollowing out of government. And this is concerning in a number of ways. First, contracting out of environmental reviews, of NEPA, for example, is increasing. There are probably more NEPAs that are conducted by engineering firms than by public employees. Probably a little less so in land management agencies, but it still is happening. And those firms, very competent in the environmental assessment work, may be less sensitive to local conditions, less willing to place time in their contracts for the preliminary work that's needed to design the right kind of an engagement process. And so there's a concern that the contracting out will be problematic over time for the generation and the funding of these ECR and collaborative governance processes. The second problem with the hollowing out situation is the ratio between public managers and contracting officers within public agencies is changing. And what does that mean? In a way, it means that as well as power disparities are shifting, so that when agencies make decisions, there may be more of an interest in contract compliance first, and then in resource protection and management second, let alone public engagement. Third, while agencies increasingly look to partnerships to leverage private dollars and collaboration to manage or spread the risk in dealing with collaborative problems, they often think of these activities as cost-free, right? They can offload some of the work to community organizations. But not only does this work take considerable agency staff, there are other transaction costs for which they're just simply not putting these in and supporting them with public funds. They are not putting into their line item budgets for projects or annual funding the need to support planning and assessment and management. That makes it hard, and maybe some of you have been engaged in under-resourced collaborative efforts that are very frustrating for stakeholders who are by and large there in a voluntary capacity, not getting paid overtime for being at all those long night meetings. So, and then finally, also related to budgets, I would add that the ups and downs and unpredictability of federal budgets that not just recently, this has been going on for some time across several administrations, particularly at the federal level, makes the profession of environmental mediation and facilitation a lot more risky. It's riskier business, to be straight with you. And as a result, if you look at the profession broadly in the country, we still have about the same number of very seasoned firms out there. And they are cherry picking the most complex and rewarding, financially rewarding also, projects. And the number of solo practitioners working at the local level have a much harder time going from project to project and making a full-time a job out of this work. So I'm upfront with you about that, and for those who are interested in working in this field as professionals, I would be glad to talk to you further about strategies you might use to counterbalance that reality. So these trends will need to be reckoned with, and they really must be. And they're going to require continuing to marshal evidence through our research and real advocacy to demand necessary accountability and support for collaboration in public policy issues. Okay, so we are getting close to where I wanted to conclude. So I want to talk about the immediate situation. And then if you're interested in my current research, you can ask me about that. Okay, so we are living in turbulent times, right? We are not just dealing with wicked problems, we're and intractable disputes. We're living in what people are calling VUCA times. Are you familiar with VUCA? VUCA times. So VUCA means volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Now, believe it or not, this term was coined well before President Trump was elected to office. Though arguably his election and the challenges he's facing, if not creating, are symptomatic of these VUCA times. But we can't put it all on his shoulders, okay? We know that federal budgets are uncertain and funding for environmental natural resources has been decreasing, not chopped the knees. We know that agency decision making, how many of you are waiting for an agency decision, before you can do your research, before you can take the next step? I mean, it's just endemic. Okay. We know that environmental issues have become partisan issues. It wasn't the case when NEPA was passed in 1969. And that contentious politics and political polarization has exacerbated environmental problem solving on the ground. So what do we do? What does this mean for you as researchers, as advocates, as instructors, as practitioners who are really interested and fascinated in this work, right? Well, I don't want you to fold up your tents by any means. This is a nation of laws, and indeed, defending those laws in court has become of great paramount importance. But that does not mean there's no room for negotiation and collaborative engagement. Our wicked problems really must be tended, and so here are my 1, 2, 3, I get about 6, maybe 7 suggestions for how you work in this field in VUCA times. Okay? Number 1, this is a focus on assessment, pre-process assessment. Now, in environmental mediation, where you're dealing with multiple parties, it is best practice and has been well known for 30 years that you assess the situation. You talk confidentially with stakeholders. You consider what the conditions might be to get all of the parties at the table, and with the right representation of the agencies, the organizations, the individuals, the constituencies that need to be there to participate in a negotiation. Well, this needs to be better understood and appreciated if you are beginning to think about a collaborative system of any kind. Assessment is essential. So you need to be asking, and be sure to be asking these kinds of questions. Are the conditions, the political, social, economic conditions ripe? Is this issue below the national radar? Is it likely to be politically fraught? Are administrative tribunals or the courts really the better forum for this? Are parties who are affected by the issue or who have rights in the issue or can veto a group decision or formally are responsible for making the decision ready and able and resourced to negotiate in good faith? So I think these threshold tests for proceeding with environmental conflict resolution and in designing appropriate collaborative forums really need to be carefully analyzed. I think the bar for engagement should be higher in these VUCA times. Don't assume. Don't be a cockeyed optimist. Okay, so 2, find the right leaders. This is always important, but I think it's particularly important now. My colleague Tina Nabachi and I emphasize the importance of initiating leadership to build collaborative systems, and that all of those parties engaged in collaboration are themselves leaders. In fact, I could spin out on how collaborative governance systems really are just leadership factories. If you think of it in those terms, rather than thinking about those parties and those stakeholders, right, put into a box, these are leaders of organizations and constituencies and communities, and the strength of the process and the outcomes is limited by the weakest link, that person who is least able or has the lesser skills for engaging and in representing their constituency or home organization. So finding the right leaders can be tough right now. You're asking someone, or 2 people perhaps, to put some political capital on the line in very difficult, testy, uncertain VUCA times, right? So it might be harder to scramble and find those leaders, but don't proceed without them, okay? The third is act locally, and we all know that is the path for thinking globally, but it may be the only path right now for really engaging in and studying ECR and collaborative governance. Work at the state and local levels, and depend less on federal agencies, or be looking at disputes or issues that may not be so dependent on federal agency action. If you're a first-year PhD student, I would suggest you really take this seriously and look at community processes perhaps, or regional efforts where you know you've got governors who are at the beginning of their terms and in safe, states where you have a little bit of policy steadiness, a little bit of political leadership steadiness in which to explore the dynamics that you want to look at, okay? Number 4, build theory. If funding's hard to come by, you can't get out on the ground, consider theory building. And I have to mention that now, and it was mentioned that I'm editor of a new journal, and it's a theory-driven journal. It is all about advancing theory in public management and governance. And the name of that journal is Perspectives on Public Management and Governance. So I encourage you to check it out. We've got lots of advanced articles online. But also, if you've read some of my work on collaborative governance, you know how critical coming up with a shared theory of change and a shared theory of action is for a group. So you want to understand those theories, and you want to understand whether they can work on the ground and where they've been tested before, and how to encourage, if you're a process manager or supporter, that kind of engagement. It's not enough just to frame problems anymore. You have to frame the approach to these solutions, the strategies, and they're based in some kind of theory about what's going to work, given the constraints that we're facing. Okay, 5, take the long view. So let me talk to those of you who are administrators here perhaps, or involved in faculty governance. For natural resource programs, continue to expose your students to social science. Both theory, but also methods. And whether you can find courses or encourage interdisciplinary study in communications and social psychology, political science and public administration, anthropology, public health planning, or law, this is a gift you give to your students to enable them to be interdisciplinarians. Okay, 6, take advantage of strange bedfellows. So, as advocates and initiators of collaborative endeavors, think about taking the time to build new partnerships and alliances while all this VUCA stuff is happening up here. You may find that there are some people with whom you have disagreed over the long haul, and with whom you've been on opposite sides of an issue, that they too are affected by uncertainty. They too are nervous and anxious about delayed decision making. They too are concerned about lack of public resources or potentially harmful, ill thought through policy proposals, okay? Who would have thought that Walmart was going to stop selling AK-47s, right? So there are a lot of people who are concerned about corporate responsibility on the one hand, or who have begun to question some of their recreational behaviors on the other hand, or as environmental advocates who are assuming that everyone should share their liberal viewpoint, right? And so the rest of you guys out here are, I'm not going to talk to you. Think about how you can step across the line, and this leads me to my final plug. And this is about your own consideration of the way in which you privately engage with others. How many of you in the last week or month have had a real conversation with someone different from you with whom you disagree? Ideologically? Okay, okay, I'm happy to see this. Okay, there are some of you, but we have, in large part in this country, forgotten how to talk across divides, right? We don't have the skills. We live in certain places. Of course, technology helps us keep into our little social media silos, right? And I think this takes us to a point, and I believe this. I also am involved in an organization that was formed after Congressman Gabby Giffords was shot several years ago, National Institute for Civil Discourse. And one of my highs is when I'm training state legislators about how to work together in bipartisan ways and generate civil discourse caucuses in their states. So civil discourse is a lot about what I'm talking about or encouraging you to do, but it's more than that. It isn't just about being civil. It's really about checking in with your intentions. Checking in with what could motivate you to take the risk of talking to someone different than you. How can you find that mode of inquiry that drives your scholarly research, right? And turn it into your human endeavors, your personal lives as you interact with people who are different than you are. So while you need to be building your skills, you also need to be checking in with what your motivation really is about. You just want to talk with them so you can sell them your pitch? Are you really willing to engage and listen to what they have to say and potentially be changed by their own personal experience through life? So I end with encouraging you to explore your own intentions, cultivate what I'm calling approachfulness. Approachfulness. I'm not sure we're going to fix the escalation of political polarization in this country anytime soon, and it's very threatening to our democratic institutions, and it's not clear how to back away from that cliff that seems to get closer and closer. But one way I know we must go is by talking with people who are different from us. So with that, thank you again for inviting me and for your attention this afternoon. I'm looking forward to your questions and want to hear about your experiences. So. A lot to absorb. Yeah.
Well, can you give us an example of, oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Can you give us an example of a moment, a tough moment in environmental conflict and negotiation where you felt really challenged and you made it through somehow?
Ah, okay.
Just a
personal story. Well, I think the toughest thing is dealing with your own prejudices and your own biases, and being more than civil but respectful to everyone and their differences. And so the most embarrassing and shameful times are when you haven't caught yourself and you say something assuming that person agrees with you, and you realize, uh-oh, I didn't do that well. And then you really need to be prepared to apologize, and often publicly, which I have had to do a few times, and step back. Apologies do go a long way. And a lot of people who are in conflict and mad at someone else will be very happy with an apology. Yep.
Oh, sure. I think you make a really strong case for the importance of like robust government, consistent government over time. Obviously, we're not having that at the moment. I'm wondering if you see any opportunity for in devolution of power to community organizations, any developments, any opportunity going on at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I do see that. I think part of the problem is we're moving in that direction somewhat, but the power is sort of stuck right now. And we're in this sort of limbo, crazy situation that constrain federal land managers, for example, from being able to really jump in and endorse collaborative engagement as much as they had. I had an interesting conversation with Tony Chang at lunch yesterday, where he is concerned about the way in which large NGOs who are able to match funds that are used as incentives to insist on or mandate collaboration disadvantage smaller local groups. So I think we still have to think about how do we do this. I don't see collaborative governance. We often talk about horizontal power sharing as different and separate from hierarchy and the regulatory state. I think collaborative governance on public policy matters it works in integration with state power in certain ways, right? And so the question is, what can be devolved? Because you often need formal authority to change what might be a resolution on the ground in one place to a consistent approach to similar settings elsewhere. Yep.
I have a question about manager turnover. So a lot of, sustained engagement and trust building is hard if people are leaving all the time and new people are coming in. And what are some ways in which you've dealt with that problem in your experience?
Yeah. Well, probably some of you are familiar with a turnover memo now in the Forest Service, where when district rangers or supervisors leave, they create a memo of where things are and the actors in their forest, so that the person coming in isn't completely clueless, because they used to be. They really just moved around so much. I think there needs to be some consideration of that policy within the Forest Service. I don't know if it's as stringent as it is in BLM. Maybe a little less turnover in BLM, or Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm not sure, because it really does it can undercut the legitimate engagement of the agency with this ongoing collaborative effort. There are also problems with leadership turnover within collaborative groups, right? And many of them are initiated by charismatic leaders who are really instrumental to creating the momentum and the glue to bring people together. And when they have to exit, that's another transition point that needs to be skillfully thought about, and hopefully with a lot of lead time, so that the group can figure out how to do that and what the succession planning requires. There's a lot in the corporate management literature on leadership succession planning. We should learn some more from them on that. Yep.
So I'll shift gears a bit.
Yeah.
On campus here we have the Center for Public Deliberation, which is run by Dr. Martin Carcassonne.
Yeah, I know.
He trains students as deliberators to be able to tackle complex community issues and whatnot. Is there an effort at the University of Arizona or anything else that you know of to utilize eager young students to train them in this sort of collaborative governance mindset and
Yeah.
faculty preference?
Yeah. Well, I run a small graduate certificate in collaborative governance, so the students learn through online courses and skill-based courses just that kind of thing that Martin presents. And we have an internship requirement for our graduate students, at least in the School of Government Public Policy, and many of them are fashioned around engagement and getting people out in the field and doing that kind of thing. So increasingly, when I started in the field, there was not a mediation class offered in law schools. And now every law school has a mediation class, negotiation class for sure. But so a lot of things have changed in how and what you are learning at the graduate level, the professional level, which is it's fantastic. It's really exciting. Probably many of you, when you were much younger, benefited from peer mediation training on the playground, right? That didn't exist 4 years ago. So I have great confidence in the next generation, in your generation, hopefully solving some of the problems we've left in your lap. Yep.
So I wonder if you could talk about a couple of strategies for enhancing engagement and public participation, especially in groups that have been either disenfranchised or disenchanted with the process.
Well, that is one of the vulnerabilities. If you've had a bad process experience, you're going to be less inclined to volunteer the next time around. And that's why I think the assessment and the design functions are so important. You don't want to fail because there's an afterlife to a failed process that can affect an entire community, you know. Again, you've got to really know what you're working with and spend that time up front, often with a core group, to think through what can we do, what's appropriate, what are the regulatory time frames that we have to deal with. Is it long enough that we can have some effective engagement? If it's too short, you got to do something else, you know. Do we need a third-party mediator? Is there enough trust in the Natural Resource Agency, the land managers, for them to facilitate the open house or a science panel or a conversation in breakout groups on what the right alternative should be for this NEPA process or that? So there are lots of different ways in which to engage the public, and I think that's number one rule. Realize that there isn't one way. And so you should become schooled in and have a broad repertoire so that you can think about what's the right forum for this fuss, and is it practicable, and can we afford it in time and staff and resources? Do we have the right science now? You may have uncertain or dueling science contexts which really require that you wait for a season or two to get the research results before you start engaging folks, right? Or do it in phases. All that requires careful design. Yep.
In your work with legislators, what do you think some of the biggest barriers are between them communicating with natural resource agencies?
Oh, okay. I've really been my work with state legislators has been more around how they communicate with themselves, with each other. And so, you know, the executive branch would be, you know, where you would look to that score. So I'm not sure I can fully answer that question. Yep.
So you briefly touched on the role of technology in collaborative governance, and I myself can imagine some of the benefits to technology in collaborative governance, and I was hoping you might, over the time, you probably see a big shift, change. What are some of the negative impacts that we should be aware of and look for if, you know, using technology in collaborative governance?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, access and skillful use of technology is not distributed evenly across the communities you want to engage. So you've got to compensate or provide training or venues or have groups meeting simultaneously and then brought together through video conferencing. So on the one hand, it's really wonderful to be able to do that, but you want to be sure that the different needs of the different groups can be met. Again, one size doesn't fit all there. I do think you need face-to-face interaction. Certainly to start out. You need to build relationships, and you just can't do that over the internet, the social media stuff aside. And you need to get on the ground and be there in the field looking at the problem. But at a certain point in collaborative governance systems where you are going to be interacting for several years, you can phone in, you can Skype, you can continue your conversation, have your committee meetings, have your board meetings, and ensure that you get larger participation with social media tools.
If everyone has access.
If everybody has access, right. Yeah. Other questions? Yep.
You sort of touched on the amount of resources and logistics that this stuff takes. And it seems like there's never like a place for all of that effort to come from. And I mean, it's hard to find sources of funding for like, I just need someone to like organize meetings and like, you know, organize all these details that end up being part of these processes. So
Yeah.
how, I mean, is that something that needs to shift like structurally? Or how do you get around that issue?
Well, I'll punt a little bit here, but an important point that I didn't stress was universities are becoming really important to this equation. You have the substantive knowledge, right? If you use it well, not necessarily as scientific advocates, but as thoughtful researchers who can explore what the choices are here, the implications, or what the level of certainty is, probabilities with the work. But you could also, and perhaps through Martin's program, you can enlist students who sadly are underpaid and or free of charge. But the university centers and programs where you're building skills and you want this kind of experience, I think will become really important. And I think that's pretty cool because, I mean, we have Ag Extension, and they are really important players, and they have, across many of their programs in the country, started to use their access to the community. Their long, hard-earned trust they've built with resource users and environmental advocates as well, to start being conveners. And I think that's an underutilized asset in a lot of land-grant colleges. Are you a land-grant university? That's what I thought. Okay, good. Other questions? Yep.
Are you noticing any major shift in funding to acknowledge some of the collaborative efforts at the same success level as environmental outcome efforts?
Well, I think it sort of depends. I do think local communities and mayors and city councils get the political added value of engaging people, especially if it's a contentious issue. So I think there's probably more resources there than previously. The other thing about local communities, you know who the car dealer is. You know who has the deep pockets that you can go tap. And you also know who might be a good, let's say you want a Republican and a Democrat, or you want a rural and an urban leader to work together on an interface issue, okay? So I think resources may be more accessible in some local communities, perhaps not in less well-heeled rural areas, but there again, you can, I think, look to Ag Extension or regionally to sort of to build them in. And in some states, in well-resourced states, I think those opportunities exist at the state level too. Yep.
I recently read a UN report on environmental peacekeeping, and it said that internationally, after conflicts occur, they're not resolved in the right, appropriate way within a 5-year period. They actually relapse. So I was wondering if you've seen that applied in this situation, and also what that might mean moving forward after this period that we're going through, what we've done and what interventions.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I think that's actually a good distinction to make between ECR, dispute-focused treatment, if you will, and collaborative governance systems, which are really designed to deal with ongoing dynamics among diverse players, whether it's in a policy sphere or a site-specific sphere. And so collaborative systems themselves could help adapt to those dynamics that might occur when political administrations change, or when there's new science, or when there's, you know, some big environmental crises of flooding or oil spills or fire, so forth. Because what I have learned in dispute resolution is that you might resolve the particularly acute dispute in a settlement, but those same players have tensions that are going to pop up again in similar areas. But maybe the next time they won't be so challenging. Maybe there'll be enough social capital built that they can refer back and start, you know, which is why I think building these forums, these collaborative governance systems or regimes, are really helpful to the continuity over time. And maybe they will begin to moderate the up and down whipsawing of our polarized situation. Other questions? Thanks a lot, and I'm around to talk further with you, and we've got coffee and good stuff at the reception. Thank you.